I watched him present my entire strategy to the executive board. Every slide, every data point, every recommendation mine. He delivered it flawlessly, taking bows for applause that should have been mine. But this time I had something he didn't know about. A hidden signature embedded in every piece of work I'd created for the past 6 months. And it was about to destroy him. This is a story about systematic workplace theft. Not the kind that involves money or physical property, but something potentially more valuable in the corporate world. Intellectual capital. It's about recognizing patterns of manipulation, understanding the psychology of credit theft, and why documentation isn't paranoia, it's protection. Most importantly, it's about the moment when patience transforms into calculated action. My name is Thea, and this is how I exposed a colleague who built his entire career on my work. I started at Morrison Analytics 3 years ago, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in data science. The company specialized in market research and strategic consulting for Fortune 500 clients. It was my dream job, the kind of place where good work got noticed and careers were built on merit. Or so I believed. The office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Seattle. Modern, sleek, filled with the kind of people who used words like synergy and leverage without irony. I was hired as a junior analyst on the Strategic Insights team, reporting directly to our department head, Patricia Chen. My starting salary was $68,000, decent for an entry-level position but not extraordinary. My cubicle was in the open floor plan area, surrounded by other junior and mid-level analysts. Standard setup, standing desk, dual monitors, ergonomic chair. The coffee was good, the benefits were better, and the work was genuinely interesting. I spent my days diving into market data, identifying trends, building predictive models. Derek Mitchell sat 3 cubicles away. He'd been with the company for 5 years, technically a senior analyst, though his title didn't quite match his experience level. He was 32 tall, with the kind of easy confidence that made people assume competence. Great at presentations, always had the right joke for client meetings, remembered everyone's names and their kids' sports schedules. We were friendly at first. He'd stop by my desk to chat about projects, ask how I was settling in, invite me to the happy hours that the team organized every other Friday. He seemed genuinely interested in mentoring junior staff, always offering to review work or provide feedback. I appreciated it. Corporate culture can be isolating when you're new, and having someone take an interest felt validating. The first incident happened 4 months into my employment. I'd spent 3 weeks developing a market segmentation analysis for a pharmaceutical client. Deep work, the kind that required late nights and weekend hours. I'd identified 7 distinct customer personas based on purchasing behavior, demographic data, and psychographic profiling. The insights were solid, potentially worth millions in targeted marketing spend for the client. I'd shared my preliminary findings with Derek, asking for feedback before presenting to Patricia. He'd been enthusiastic, suggested a few minor adjustments to the presentation format, praised the depth of analysis. 2 days later, in our team meeting, Derek presented the entire framework as his own work. Every persona, every insight, every recommendation. He'd even used my exact phrasing in several slides. I sat there stunned, unable to process what was happening. Patricia was impressed, praising the sophistication of the analysis. The other team members nodded approvingly. And Derek basked in the recognition, promising to develop the framework further for the final client presentation. After the meeting, I approached him privately. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. I explained that the work he'd presented was actually mine, that I'd shared it with him for feedback, not for him to present as his own. Derek looked genuinely confused, apologetic even. He insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that he thought we were collaborating on the project, that he'd absolutely make sure I got proper credit in the client presentation. He seemed so sincere that I wanted to believe him. Maybe it really was a miscommunication. Corporate collaboration could be murky, boundaries unclear. I told myself to be more explicit about ownership going forward, to document contributions more carefully. Patricia eventually learned the truth after I mentioned it casually in a one-on-one meeting. She seemed concerned, assured me it wouldn't happen again, but no formal correction was ever made. The second incident occurred 3 months later. A competitive analysis framework I'd developed for a retail client. Same pattern. I'd shared work in progress with Derek. He'd presented it as his own in a client meeting I wasn't invited to. This time when I confronted him, the apology was briefer, the explanation vaguer. He promised to be more careful about attribution. The third time I started keeping records. Email timestamps, version histories, document metadata. I began to notice the pattern more clearly. Derek would engage me in casual conversations about my projects, asking thoughtful questions that made me want to share more. He'd position himself as a sounding board, someone helping me develop my ideas. Then those ideas would appear in his presentations, his client reports, his strategy documents. By the fourth incident, I'd reported the problem to Patricia multiple times. She acknowledged the issue, promised to address it, suggested that I be more protective of my work. But Derek was popular with clients, brought in significant revenue, had relationships with senior leadership that I didn't. The implicit message was clear. Proving credit theft was complicated, creating conflict was risky, maybe I should just focus on producing more work. The fifth time broke something in me. I'd developed an entire predictive model for customer churn, weeks of sophisticated statistical work. Derek presented it to our CEO during a leadership retreat I wasn't senior enough to attend. He received a performance bonus of $15,000 for the innovation. I received nothing, not even acknowledgement. That's when I stopped trying to work within the system. That's when I started building my case. And that's when I learned about digital watermarking. The realization came during a late-night research session. I was reading about intellectual property protection in the digital age and stumbled across an article about steganography, the practice of hiding information within other information. Specifically, hiding metadata and tracking codes within documents, spreadsheets, and presentations in ways that were invisible to casual users but provable with the right tools. I spent the next week learning everything I could about digital watermarking techniques for corporate documents. There were several approaches, ranging from simple to sophisticated. The key was making them subtle enough that someone stealing your work wouldn't notice, but robust enough to survive copying, reformatting, and even recreation in different software. I settled on a multi-layered approach. First, metadata embedding. Every Excel file, every PowerPoint presentation, every Word document I created would have my name and employee ID embedded in multiple hidden fields. Not just the standard author field that anyone could change, but deeper metadata that persisted through copying and modification. Second, visual watermarks using near-invisible text. I'd embed my initials or employee ID in white or near-white text in strategic locations throughout documents. Sometimes in headers or footers. Sometimes in text boxes hidden behind other elements. Sometimes in alt text for images. Invisible to the eye but searchable if you knew where to look. Third and most sophisticated was pattern encoding. I developed a system of intentional quirks in my analysis work. Specific formatting choices in spreadsheets, particular color schemes in visualizations, distinctive phrasing patterns in written analysis. Individual elements could be coincidence, but the combination created a signature as unique as a fingerprint. I also began maintaining parallel documentation. For every project, I created a detailed log. Initial concept development, research sources, analytical methods, drafts and iterations, timestamps for every significant milestone. I stored these logs in a personal cloud account completely separate from company systems, updated daily with automatic version history. The most important element was establishing prior creation. Whenever I completed a significant piece of work, I'd email it to my personal email account with a detailed subject line. Not company confidential material, just enough to prove I'd created specific analyses on specific dates. I'd also print key documents and have them notarized with timestamps. Extreme? Maybe. But I was building a legal case, and legal cases required evidence. Derek had no idea any of this was happening. From his perspective, nothing had changed. I was still friendly, still collaborative, still sharing information about my projects when he asked. But now every project was documented, watermarked, and traceable. The sixth theft began in February. Morrison Analytics had landed a massive new client, a technology company looking to restructure their entire go-to-market strategy. The project was worth $3.2 million in consulting fees, with potential for ongoing work worth tens of millions. Patricia assigned it to Derek as lead, with me as a supporting analyst. In our initial project meeting, Derek outlined his vision for the engagement. It was ambitious, client-facing, exactly the kind of high-visibility work that led to promotions and significant bonuses. He needed comprehensive market analysis, competitive positioning, customer segmentation, and strategic recommendations. Timeline was aggressive. 6 weeks to initial presentation, 12 weeks to final deliverables. I threw myself into the work. Late nights became normal, weekends disappeared. I built market models, analyzed competitor strategies, identified white space opportunities. The analysis was some of the best work of my career, genuinely innovative thinking about market dynamics. Derek was attentive and appreciative during this phase. He'd stop by my desk regularly, review my progress, praise the quality of my analysis. He positioned himself as the project lead who was empowering me to do great work, the mentor helping me develop my skills. To an outside observer, it probably looked like effective leadership. But I'd learned to recognize the pattern. The overly detailed questions about methodology. The requests to see work in progress, not just final deliverables. The casual suggestions that I email him copies of everything for his review. He was gathering material, positioning himself to understand my work well enough to present it as his own. 5 weeks in, Derek scheduled a meeting with Patricia and the client leadership team. The agenda was to present our preliminary findings and strategic framework. I wasn't invited to the presentation. Derek explained that having too many consultants in the room could be overwhelming for the client, that he'd represent the team's work, that there would be plenty of opportunities for me to interface with the client later in the engagement. I smiled and nodded and said I understood. Then I went back to my desk and prepared for what came next. The night before Derek's presentation, I sent a carefully worded email to Patricia and our head of human resources, Margaret Foster. The subject line was simple: documentation of intellectual property concerns. The email detailed the 6 incidents of credit theft, provided timestamps and evidence for each, and explained the watermarking systems I'd implemented. I attached comprehensive documentation, metadata reports, timeline analysis, notarized documents, everything. I explained that I wasn't trying to sabotage an important client engagement, but that I had a professional and ethical obligation to ensure proper attribution of work. I noted that Derek would be presenting my analysis the following day as his own work, and that the embedded watermarks and metadata would prove this conclusively. I offered to present the material myself if appropriate, or to simply be acknowledged as the primary analyst on the work. Then I waited. The next morning I arrived at the office at 7:30. Derek's presentation to the client was scheduled for 10. Patricia's office door was closed, unusual for that early in the morning. Through the glass walls I could see her in intense conversation with Margaret from HR and Robert Chin, our Chief Operating Officer. At 8:15 my phone rang. Patricia, asking me to come to the conference room on the executive floor. Her tone was carefully neutral, the kind of professional courtesy that could mean anything. The conference room felt enormous. Patricia sat at the head of the table with Margaret on her left and Robert on her right. A laptop was open in front of them, screen angled away from where I'd be sitting. They gestured for me to take a seat. Patricia spoke first. She thanked me for bringing the situation to their attention, acknowledged that the documentation I'd provided was thorough and concerning, and explained that they'd spent the early morning reviewing everything I'd sent. They'd also pulled Derek's project files and examined the metadata and watermarking I'd described. The evidence was conclusive. Every piece of work Derek had prepared for today's client presentation contained my digital signatures. The metadata showed my employee ID as the original creator, with modification timestamps that matched Derek's access to the files. The visual watermarks were present and verifiable. The pattern analysis showed distinctive elements of my analytical style throughout the work. More damaging for Derek, they'd gone back and reviewed the previous 5 incidents I'd documented. In each case, my claims were verified by digital forensics. The market segmentation analysis from Incident 1? My metadata was embedded throughout, despite Derek's presentation file showing him as the author. The competitive analysis framework? Same story. All of it, every single theft, was provable with the evidence I'd methodically collected. Robert asked me direct questions about my documentation methods. Why had I started watermarking my work? When had I implemented the various tracking systems? Had I informed Derek that I was doing this? I answered honestly. I'd implemented the systems after the 3rd incident of theft. I'd done it to protect my intellectual property and establish clear ownership. And no, I had not informed Derek because the entire point was to catch him in the act if he stole my work again. Margaret's questions focused on workplace dynamics and previous reporting. I walked through every conversation I'd had with Patricia about Derek's behavior, every time I'd raised concerns, every promise that the situation would be addressed. I kept my tone factual and unemotional, simply recounting what had happened. Patricia looked genuinely troubled. She acknowledged that she should have taken more decisive action earlier, that she'd prioritized avoiding conflict over protecting my work, that she'd failed in her responsibility as a manager. The apology seemed sincere, but apologies didn't change what had happened. Robert made a decision. The client presentation would proceed as scheduled, but I would be the one presenting the work. Derek would be present but only in a supporting role, and the client would be informed of the correct attribution. Additionally, Derek would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into professional conduct violations. The meeting ended. I had 90 minutes to prepare for the most important presentation of my career. I spent those 90 minutes in an empty office, reviewing my analysis and building the presentation narrative. The work itself was solid. I'd spent weeks developing it. But presenting to C-level executives and senior leaders required a different skill set than creating the analysis. I needed to be confident, clear, and compelling. Patricia stopped by 20 minutes before the meeting. She offered to present alongside me to provide support and help manage client questions. I appreciated the offer but declined. This was my work, my moment. I needed to own it completely. At 9:50, we gathered in the executive conference room. The client team consisted of their Chief Strategy Officer, VP of Marketing, VP of Sales, and 2 directors from their corporate development group. Morrison Analytics was represented by Patricia, Robert, Derek, and me. Derek looked shell-shocked. He clearly knew something had gone wrong but probably hadn't grasped the full extent of the situation. He avoided eye contact with me, sitting at the far end of the table and studying his phone intently. Patricia opened the meeting with brief introductions, then explained there had been a change in presentation leadership. Thea, who had led the analytical work on this engagement, would be walking through our findings and recommendations. Derek would be available to address any questions about implementation planning. I saw the client team exchange glances, slightly confused by the last-minute change but willing to proceed. Then I began presenting. The first 15 minutes covered market analysis and competitive positioning. I walked through the data methodically, explaining how I'd segmented the market, identified key trends, and analyzed competitor strategies. The clients asked smart questions, digging into methodology and assumptions. I answered each one confidently, showing depth of understanding that came from having done the actual analytical work. The middle section addressed customer segmentation and targeting strategy. This was the most innovative part of the analysis, where I'd identified 3 underserved customer segments that represented significant growth opportunities. I could see the client executives leaning forward, genuinely engaged with the insights. The final section outlined strategic recommendations and implementation roadmap. Specific, actionable, tied directly to the analysis I'd presented. By the end, the client team was nodding, asking follow-up questions about timelines and resource requirements. The Chief Strategy Officer spoke first. He praised the quality and depth of the analysis, called it exactly what they'd been looking for, and asked about next steps for the implementation phase. Patricia fielded that question, outlining the proposed timeline and team structure for the ongoing engagement. Then came the question I'd been anticipating. The VP of Marketing addressed Derek directly, asking about his role in developing the analysis. This was Derek's moment to either tell the truth or dig himself deeper into lies. Derek stammered something about collaborative process and team effort and his focus being on client relationship management. It was a politician's answer, technically not a lie but designed to obscure the truth. Robert interjected smoothly. He explained that Morrison Analytics believed in clear attribution of intellectual work, that Thea had been the primary architect of the entire strategic framework, and that Derek's contribution had been in project coordination and client interfacing. The message was diplomatic but the implication was clear. Thea did the real work. The meeting concluded with handshakes and expressions of satisfaction from the client team. They'd gotten the high-quality analysis they'd paid for, even if the presentation dynamics had been slightly unusual. Patricia scheduled follow-up meetings to discuss the implementation phase. As the client team filed out, Derek finally looked at me. No words were exchanged, but his expression said everything. He knew he'd been caught. More importantly, he knew I'd outmaneuvered him completely. The formal investigation began that afternoon. Margaret from HR conducted interviews with everyone on the Strategic Insights team, asking about project collaboration, credit attribution, and workplace dynamics. The questions were specific and pointed, clearly informed by the documentation I'd provided. Over the next week, the full extent of Derek's credit theft became apparent. It wasn't just my work he'd stolen. 3 other analysts came forward with similar stories, patterns of Derek appropriating their analysis and presenting it as his own. One had left the company 6 months earlier, partially due to frustration over not receiving credit for her work. Another had stopped volunteering for high-visibility projects because Derek always seemed to end up with the recognition. The pattern was systematic. Derek had built his entire professional reputation at Morrison Analytics on stolen intellectual work. The competitive analyses that had impressed clients? Done by junior analysts. The market segmentation frameworks? Developed by team members who never appeared in client meetings. The predictive models? Created by people like me who did the sophisticated technical work while Derek handled the presentation and relationship management. His performance reviews were revisited with this new understanding. What had been praised as leadership and mentorship was actually manipulation and theft. The bonuses he'd received, the salary increases, the promotion track he was on. All based on false pretenses. Morrison Analytics faced a serious problem. Derek had been the face of several major client relationships. Removing him from those engagements risked client satisfaction and revenue. But keeping him would be ethically indefensible and would destroy morale among the analytical staff who actually did the work. The decision came down from executive leadership 10 days after my presentation. Derek was terminated for cause, effective immediately. The official reason given was professional misconduct and violation of intellectual property policies. His equity grants were forfeited, his bonuses from the previous year were being recalculated based on actual work contribution, and Morrison Analytics was considering legal action to recover compensation he'd received under false pretenses. I was promoted to senior analyst with immediate effect. My salary was increased to $95,000, a raise of $27,000. I was assigned as lead analyst on the technology client engagement, with authority to build my own team. Additionally, I received a retroactive bonus of $22,000, compensating me for the previous instances where Derek had received credit and compensation for my work. But the changes went beyond my individual situation. Morrison Analytics implemented new policies around work attribution and intellectual property documentation. All strategic work now required explicit documentation of contributor roles. Presentations to clients needed approval from project team members, not just project leads. Performance reviews were restructured to include peer feedback about credit attribution and collaboration. Patricia was not fired, but she was removed from her role as department head. Robert explained privately that while she hadn't participated in the theft directly, she'd failed in her responsibility to address it when it was reported. She was reassigned to an individual contributor role, a significant demotion that effectively ended her management career at the company. The client engagement proceeded successfully. My team delivered the implementation roadmap on schedule. The client was thrilled with the results, and Morrison Analytics secured a contract extension worth $4.7 million. I presented directly to the client's CEO at their quarterly board meeting, an opportunity that would have been Derek's if not for his theft. 3 months after Derek's termination, I received a LinkedIn message from him. It was long, rambling, attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, suggesting that corporate environments were complicated and credit attribution was never clear-cut. He claimed he'd always intended to acknowledge my contributions, that he'd been planning to recommend me for promotion, that the investigation had been an overreaction. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He'd stolen years of my work, damaged my career progression, and gaslit me into questioning my own perceptions. The evidence had been conclusive, the consequences appropriate. His attempt to reframe the narrative was pathetic. 6 months later, I learned through mutual connections that Derek had landed at a smaller consulting firm. His LinkedIn profile made no mention of Morrison Analytics beyond the bare facts of his employment dates. He'd reinvented his professional story, scrubbed away the context of his departure, and was apparently trying to rebuild his career. I wondered if he'd learned anything, if he'd stopped stealing other people's work, if he'd developed actual skills rather than just appropriating others' analysis. But ultimately it wasn't my concern. I'd protected myself, exposed the theft, and ensured that at least in one workplace systematic credit theft had serious consequences. The year following Derek's termination was transformative for my career. The technology client engagement led to 3 additional projects with related companies, all of which I led. My team grew from just me to 4 analysts, all talented people who'd been underutilized in previous roles. We developed a reputation for innovative strategic thinking and rigorous analysis. My compensation increased again at the annual review cycle. Base salary rose to $112,000, and I received a performance bonus of $38,000. More importantly, I was invited to join Morrison Analytics Partnership Track, a distinction typically reserved for people with 7 to 10 years of experience. I'd earned it in less than 4 years, primarily because my actual contributions were finally visible. The culture shift in the Strategic Insights department was noticeable. Junior analysts were more willing to share their work, more confident that they'd receive appropriate credit. The toxic dynamic of credit theft had been rooted out, replaced by genuine collaboration. People built on each other's ideas openly, knowing that contribution would be acknowledged. I implemented a practice in my team of extremely explicit attribution. Every deliverable included a contributions section, clearly stating who did what work. Presentations began with a slide acknowledging all team members and their specific roles. It took extra time but created a culture where people felt safe sharing their best thinking. Patricia and I eventually had a one-on-one conversation about what had happened. She apologized again, more substantively this time. She explained that she'd been conditioned by corporate culture to avoid conflict, to assume that capable people would naturally get recognized, that problems would resolve themselves. She'd prioritized keeping things smooth over protecting people's work. It was a failure of leadership, she acknowledged, and one she regretted deeply. I appreciated her honesty. Her demotion had been difficult, a professional blow that would affect the rest of her career. But she'd earned it by failing to act when action was needed. Managers have power, and with power comes responsibility to protect people who report to them. The notoriety of the situation spread through professional networks. I started receiving messages from consultants and analysts at other firms, people who'd experienced similar credit theft but hadn't known how to address it. Some asked for advice about documentation strategies. Others just wanted to share their own stories of having work stolen, finding validation that their experiences were real and wrong. I realized that workplace credit theft was more common than I'd understood. The dynamics were always similar. Junior person does substantive work, senior person presents it. Systems and culture make it difficult to prove theft or seek remediation. It thrived in environments that valued presentation over substance, where the person delivering the message was assumed to be the person who created the content. My case became something of a cautionary tale in consulting circles. The importance of documentation, the power of digital watermarking, the necessity of creating paper trails. Some people thought I'd been overly paranoid, too focused on protecting myself rather than trusting colleagues. But most recognized that I'd been forced into that position by systematic theft and institutional failure to address it. Looking back, several lessons stand out. First, trust your instincts. When the second incident of credit theft happened, I knew something was wrong. I should have implemented documentation systems immediately rather than waiting for a third and fourth occurrence. My desire to believe in good faith misunderstandings cost me months of unrecognized work. Second, document everything. In professional environments, perception often matters more than reality. The only way to combat that is with objective evidence that can't be disputed. Metadata, timestamps, email trails, version histories. These create a factual record that cuts through he said, she said dynamics. Third, understand that some people are systematic manipulators. Derek wasn't making honest mistakes or having misunderstandings about collaboration. He had a deliberate strategy of appropriating others' work, and he'd refined that strategy over years. Giving him the benefit of the doubt wasn't kindness, it was enabling theft. Fourth, institutional systems often fail individuals until the evidence is overwhelming. Patricia had known about the credit theft, had been informed multiple times, had even acknowledged the problem. But she didn't take meaningful action until I presented irrefutable proof that forced a response. Hoping that management will spontaneously protect you is naive. Fifth, the best revenge is excellence coupled with evidence. I didn't sabotage Derek's work or trash his reputation or play political games. I simply did exceptional analysis, documented it meticulously, and let the facts speak when the moment came. That approach was more devastating than any emotional retaliation could have been. Finally, workplace justice is possible but requires strategic thinking. Change doesn't happen through appeals to fairness or by hoping people will do the right thing. It happens when you build an airtight case, present it at the strategic moment, and force decision makers to act on clear evidence rather than vague concerns. If you've experienced credit theft in your workplace, you're not paranoid and you're not alone. The dynamics I described are common across industries and organizations. Documentation isn't about distrust, it's about protecting your professional contributions in environments where attribution matters for career advancement. Consider this story a reminder that evidence defeats gaslighting, that patience coupled with preparation can lead to justice, and that systematic problems require systematic solutions. Your work deserves recognition. Don't let anyone steal what you've created. If this story resonated with you or if you've faced similar situations, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Your experiences matter, and sharing them helps others recognize and address credit theft in their own workplaces. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more stories about workplace justice, strategic revenge, and standing up for yourself in professional environments. New videos every week.